11 1, 2, 3. Fundamental categories of thought and of nature. The selection and the following one were unpublished in Peirce's lifetime. They develop related themes and will repay joint study. This piece, the less developed of the two, was written first, in 1885, and is therefore printed first here. But if the reader is not certain that he or she understands the categories of firstness, secondness, and thirdness, it may be best to read chapter I of the following selection before reading this essay. Peirce here explains the categorical relation between his logic and his typology of signs. He then supports his monism by explaining logic and semiotic in terms of consciousness, or psychological phenomena, and then psychological phenomena in terms of cognition, and cognition in terms of neurology. The neurological discussion is here omitted because Peirce pursues the question more clearly and in more detail in the next selection. Source, MS 901. Kant, the king of modern thought, it was who first remarked the frequency in logical analytics of trichotomies or threefold distinctions. It really is so. I have tried hard and long to persuade myself that it is only fanciful, but the facts will not countenance that way of disposing of the phenomenon. Take any ordinary syllogism, all men are mortal, Elijah was a man, therefore, Elijah was mortal. There are here three propositions, namely, two premises and a conclusion. There are also three terms, man, mortal, and Elijah. If we transpose one of the premises with the conclusion, denying both, we obtain what are called the indirect figures of syllogism. For example, all men are mortal, but Elijah was not mortal, therefore, Elijah was not a man. Elijah was not mortal, but Elijah was a man, but Elijah was a man, therefore, some men are not mortal. Thus, there are three figures of ordinary syllogism. It is true there are other modes of inference which do not come under any of these heads, but that does not annul the fact that we have here a trichotomy. Indeed, if we examine by itself what is by some logicians called the fourth figure, we find that it also has three varieties related to one another as the three figures of ordinary syllogism. There is an entirely different way of conceiving the relations of the figures of syllogism, namely by means of the conversion of propositions. But from that point of view also the same classes are preserved. De Morgan has added a large number of new syllogistic moods which do not find places in this classification. The reasoning in these is of a peculiar character and introduces the principle of dilemma. Still, regarding these dilemmatic reasonings by themselves, they fall into three classes in a precisely similar manner. Again, I have shown that the probable and approximate inferences of science must be classified on the very same principles, being either deductions, inductions, or hypotheses. Other examples of threes in logic are statements of what is actual, what is possible, and what is necessary, the three kinds of forms, names, propositions, and inferences, affirmative, negative, and uncertain answers to a question. One very important triad is this: it has been found that there are three kinds of signs which are all indispensable in all reasoning. The first is the diagrammatic sign or icon, which exhibits a similarity or analogy to the subject of discourse. The second is the index, which like a pronoun demonstrative or relative, forces the attention to the particular object intended without describing it. The third is the general name or description which signifies its object by means of an association of ideas or habitual connection between the name and the character signified. But there is one triad in particular which throws a strong light on the nature of all the others. Namely, we find it necessary to recognize in logic three kinds of characters, three kinds of facts. First, there are singular characters which are predicible of single objects, as when we say that anything is white, large, etc. Secondly, there are dual characters which appertain to pairs of objects. These are implied by all relative terms as lover, similar, other, etc. Thirdly, there are plural characters, which can all be reduced to triple characters but not to dual characters. Thus, we cannot express the fact that A is a benefactor of B by any descriptions of A and B separately. We must introduce a relative term. This is requisite, not merely in English, but in every language which might be invented. This is true even of such a fact as A is taller than B. If we say, A is tall, but B is short, the conjugation but has a relative force, and if we omit this word the mere collocation of the two sentences is a relative or dual mode of signifying. We must, however, recognize two kinds of relative characters, those which can be implied in such a mere collocation and those, like A's benefiting B, which cannot. The mathematicians say that two straight lines constitute a degenerate conic. To borrow this expression we may say that the mere collocation of two facts about A and B constitutes a degenerate relation. In this case, the two facts are seen by the mind to be in relation to one another. As the old logicians said, relations are divisible into real relations or relations of reason. Let us now consider a triple character, say that A gives B to C. This is not a mere congeries of dual characters. It is not enough to say that A parts with C, and that B receives C. A synthesis of these two facts must be made to bring them into a single fact. We must express that C in being parted with by A is received by B. If, on the other hand, we take a quadruple fact, it is easy to express as a compound of two triple facts. Thus, suppose A gives B to C in exchange for D. Then, if we take the word sale to include the parting with a thing in exchange not merely for money but for any object in barter, we may express the fact in question thus: A makes a sale, E, to C, and E is a sale of B in exchange for D. We are here able to express the synthesis of the two facts into one, because a triple character involves the conception of synthesis. Analysis involves the same relations as synthesis, so that we may explain the fact that all plural facts can be reduced to triple facts in this way. A road with a fork in it is the analog of a triple fact, because it brings three to many into relation with one another. A dual fact is like a road without a fork, it only connects two to many. Now, no combination of roads without forks can have more than two to many, but any number of to many can be connected by roads which nowhere have a knot of more than three ways. See the figure, where I have drawn the to many as self-returning roads, in order to introduce nothing beyond the road itself. Thus, the three essential elements of a network of roads are road about a terminus, roadway connection, and branching, and in like manner, the three fundamental categories of fact are, fact about an object, fact about two objects, relation, fact about several objects, synthetic fact. We have seen that the mere coexistence of two singular facts constitutes a degenerate form of dual fact, and in like manner there are two orders of degeneracy in plural facts, for either they may consist in a mere synthesis of facts of which the highest is dual, or they may consist in a mere synthesis of singular facts. This explains why there should be three classes of signs, for there is a triple connection of sign, thing signified, cognition produced in the mind. There may be a mere relation of reason between the sign and the thing signified, in that case the sign is an icon. Or there may be a direct physical connection, in that case, the sign is an index. Or there may be a relation which consists in the fact that the mind associates the sign with its object. In that case the sign is a name. Now consider the difference between a logical term, a proposition, and an inference. A term is a mere general description, and as neither icon nor index possess generality, it must be a name, and it is nothing more. A proposition is also a general description, but it differs from a term in that it purports to be in a real relation to the fact, to be really determined by it. Thus, a proposition can only be formed of the conjunction of a name and an index. An inference, too, contains a general description and purports to really represent the fact, but it does more, it professes to give in its premises such a representation of the fact that by the contemplation of them something else may be learned about the thing. This it can only do by presenting an analog or icon of the fact, and thus we see why all three kinds of signs are requisite for inference. By such sort of synthesis, the whole organism of logic may be mentally evolved from the three conceptions of first, second, and third, or more precisely, an, other, medium. But if these three conceptions enter as we find they do as elements of all conceptions connected with reasoning, they must be virtually in the mind when reasoning first commences. In that sense, at least, they must be innate ideas, and consequently they must be capable of explanation. Psychologically, there must be in the consciousness three faculties corresponding to these three categories of logic. Now, we know that the introspective psychologists have for a long time told us that the mind has three fundamental faculties, the feeling of pleasure and pain, volition and desire, and cognition. Let us see, then, if we cannot modify the statement so that without being less true to the phenomena of introspective consciousness even more true, if possible it may be put into a form in which it will serve as the psychological explanation, which must surely lie somewhere, of the new facts which we bring from the study of logic. The ordinary doctrine is open to a variety of objections from the very point of view from which it was first delineated. First, desire certainly includes an element of pleasure quite as much as of will. Wishing is not willing, it is a speculative variation of willing mingled with the speculative and anticipatory feeling of pleasure. Desire should therefore be struck out of the definition of the second faculty, leaving it mere volition. But volition without desire is not voluntary, it is mere activity. Consequently, all activity, voluntary or not, should be brought under the second faculty. Thus attention is a kind of activity which is sometimes voluntary and sometimes not so. Second, pleasure and pain can only be recognized as such in a judgment, they are general predicates which are attached to feelings rather than true feelings. But mere passive feeling, which does not act and does not judge, which has all sorts of qualities but does not itself recognize these qualities, because it does not analyze nor compare, this is an element of all consciousness to which a distinct title ought to be given. Third, every phenomenon of our mental life is more or less like cognition. Every emotion, every burst of passion, every exercise of will is like cognition. But modifications of consciousness which are alike have some element in common. Cognition, therefore, has nothing distinctive and cannot be regarded as a fundamental faculty. If, however, we ask whether there be not an element in cognition which is neither feeling, sense, nor activity, we do find something, the faculty of learning, acquisition, memory and inference, synthesis. Fourth, looking once more at activity, we observe that the only consciousness we have of it is the sense of resistance. We are conscious of hitting or of getting hit, of meeting with a fact. But whether the activity is within or without we know only by secondary signs and not by our original faculty of recognizing fact. It seems, then, that the true categories of consciousness are, first, feeling, the consciousness which can be included with an instant of time, passive consciousness of quality without recognition or analysis. Second, consciousness of an interruption into the field of consciousness, sense of resistance, of an external fact, of another something. Third, synthetic consciousness binding time together, sense of learning, thought. If we accept these are the fundamental elementary modes of consciousness, they afford a psychological explanation of the three logical conceptions of quality, relation, and synthesis or mediation. The conception of quality, which is absolutely simple in itself and yet viewed in its relations is seen to be full of variety, would arise whenever feeling or the singular consciousness becomes prominent. The conception of relation comes from the dual consciousness or sense of action and reaction. The conception of mediation springs out of the plural consciousness or sense of learning.